Somewhere beneath the Atlantic Ocean, according to the most repeated story in Western history, there is a civilization waiting to be found. A continent-sized island with concentric rings of water and land, gold-plated temples, advanced technology, and a navy powerful enough to threaten the entire Mediterranean world. It disappeared in a single day and night. And the only person who ever described it in detail was a Greek philosopher writing in 360 BC, who may have invented the entire thing. This is the story of Atlantis. Not the movie version. Not the History Channel version. The actual story, where it came from, what it says, what archaeology has found. And the one detail about the original text that nobody ever mentions.
Atlantis, the story never finished.
Atlantis is not an ancient legend. It is not a myth passed down through generations of oral tradition. It is not a story that predates writing or that was discovered carved into temple walls. Atlantis appears in exactly 2 texts in all of human history, and both of them were written by the same person, at the same time, as part of the same philosophical project. The person was Plato. The texts were the Timaeus and the Critias, written around 360 BC. Plato was the most influential philosopher of the ancient world, student of Socrates, teacher of Aristotle, founder of the academy in Athens. He was not a historian. He was not a geographer. He was a philosopher who used stories to make arguments, and Atlantis was one of his stories. In the Timaeus, Plato describes Atlantis through the voice of a character named Cretias, who claims the story was told to the Athenian statesman Solon by Egyptian priests during a visit to Egypt around 590 BC. The priests supposedly had records going back 9,000 years, records that described a great island civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is what the Greeks called the Strait of Gibraltar, that had once launched a massive invasion of the Mediterranean world. This civilization was defeated by a prehistoric Athens, a version of Athens so ancient that no Greek in Plato's time had any memory of it. And then, in a single day and night of earthquakes and floods, both the ancient Athens and the island of Atlantis disappeared beneath the sea. The description that follows in the Critias is extraordinarily specific. Atlantis is described as larger than Libya and Asia combined, that is, larger than all of North Africa and the Middle East put together. It is located beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean. Its capital city is a series of concentric rings, alternating circles of land and water, each precisely measured with a central island containing a temple to Poseidon, plated in gold, silver, and a metal called orichalcum that the text describes as more valuable than anything except gold. The island has mountains to the north that protect it from cold winds. It has a vast agricultural plain to the south. It has a population of enormous military capacity, 10,000 chariots, 1,200 warships, and it is ruled by the descendants of Poseidon, the god of the sea, who founded the civilization by mating with a mortal woman named Cleito on the central hill of the island. This is the complete origin of Atlantis. 2 dialogues, 1 author, written in 360 BC. Everything else, every book, every documentary, every theory about its location, every claim about its technology, every argument about whether it was real, is built on top of those 2 texts and nothing else. The first question that everyone asks is whether Plato was describing something real. The second question, which is actually more interesting, is what Plato was doing if he was not.
Part 1. The real text by Plato.
The description of Atlantis in Plato's Critias is specific enough to have generated 2,000 years of serious geographical debate. The measurements are precise. The architectural details are elaborate. The political system is described in careful detail, 10 kings, 1 for each of the 10 portions of the island. Each descended from one of the 5 pairs of twin sons of Poseidon and Cleito. The laws are specific, the rituals are documented. The military capacity is enumerated with the kind of detail that suggests either a real source or an author who wanted very badly to be taken seriously. But the context in which Plato introduces the story tells a different story. At the beginning of the Timaeus, Socrates, Plato's philosophical mouthpiece, explains that he has spent the previous day describing his vision of the ideal state. and that now he wants to see that ideal state in action. He wants a story that shows the perfect society facing and defeating its enemies. And Creatus conveniently produces one, a story in which a prehistoric Athens, organized exactly according to Plato's philosophical ideals, defeats a massive naval empire. The perfect society wins. The corrupt empire loses. Both disappear, leaving no archaeological trace, which conveniently means the story cannot be verified. The philosopher Pierre Vidal-Naquet, whose work on Plato's Atlantis is considered one of the most rigorous analyses of the texts, argued that Atlantis was Plato's deliberate political allegory, a warning to Athens about the dangers of naval imperialism and democratic excess. In Plato's time, Athens had spent the previous century building exactly the kind of naval empire that Atlantis represents in the text: wealthy, technologically advanced, militarily dominant, and ultimately destroyed by its own ambition in the Peloponnesian War. The Critias was written roughly a generation after Athens's catastrophic defeat in that war. The parallels are not subtle. Atlantis is described as a naval superpower that overreaches and is punished by the gods. Athens in Plato's time had been exactly that. The prehistoric Athens that defeats Atlantis in the story is a land-based, philosophically governed society, exactly the kind of Athens that Plato spent his career arguing his contemporaries should rebuild. This does not necessarily mean Atlantis was pure invention. Plato regularly used older stories and adapted them for philosophical purposes. The question is whether there was an older story, a real event, a real civilization, a real catastrophe that he was drawing on when he constructed his allegory. And here is where the archaeology becomes way relevant.
Part 2. A civilization meant to exist.
In the middle of the Aegean Sea, roughly halfway between mainland Greece and the coast of Turkey, there is a group of islands called the Cyclades. The southernmost of these islands, a roughly circular island called Santorini, or Thera in ancient Greek, is what remains of a volcano. The rest of the volcano is at the bottom of the sea. Around 1600 BC, give or take a century, depending on which dating method you use, the volcano beneath Thera erupted in one of the largest volcanic events in the history of human civilization. The eruption was 4 times more powerful than the 1883 Krakatoa eruption, which was heard 3,000 miles away. It created a tsunami that archaeological evidence suggests reached heights of 30 meters or more when it struck the coastlines of the eastern Mediterranean. It deposited ash across the entire region. Ash layers from this eruption have been identified in ice cores from Greenland and in sediment records from the Black Sea. The civilization that lived in this part of the Mediterranean when the eruption occurred was the Minoans, centered on the island of Crete, roughly 100 kilometers south of Santorini. The Minoans were the most advanced civilization in the pre-classical Mediterranean. Their palace complex at Naissus on Crete covered 20,000 square meters. They had a sophisticated system of writing linear A that has never been deciphered. They had indoor plumbing, sophisticated frescoes, an extensive trade network reaching Egypt and the Middle East, and a naval capacity that allowed them to dominate Mediterranean commerce for centuries. The Minoan civilization effectively ends around 1450 BC. The palaces are destroyed. The trade network collapses. Linear A disappears from the archaeological record. Whether the Thera eruption caused this collapse directly, or whether it weakened the Minoan world sufficiently that other groups, possibly Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland, were able to move in and complete the destruction, is still debated by archaeologists. What is documented is that the most powerful maritime civilization in the pre-classical Mediterranean disappeared within a few generations of one of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded history. The Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos proposed in 1939 that the destruction of the Minoan civilization by the Thera eruption was the historical kernel behind the Atlantis story. His argument was straightforward: a large island civilization, dominant maritime power, suddenly destroyed, and the story preserved in Egyptian records that Solon supposedly heard would have been an Egyptian account of the end of Minoan trading relationships with Egypt, which are archaeologically documented. The Minoans traded extensively with Egypt. Egyptian records from this period exist. The cessation of Minoan trade and the appearance of Mycenaean Greek traders in Egyptian records marks a specific historical transition. The problem with Marinatos's theory is the scale. Plato's Atlantis is described as larger than Libya and Asia combined, that is, a continent. Minoan Crete is an island roughly 250 kilometers long. Plato's Atlantis is in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Crete is in the Aegean. The numbers do not match. The geography does not match, unless Plato was working from a corrupted or translated source, which is exactly what the text claims he was. The story supposedly passed from Egyptian priests to Solon in oral conversation, then through 3 generations of Solon's family before Creatus wrote it down. If the original event was the Thera eruption and the Minoan collapse, 2 centuries of oral transmission through Egyptian and Greek intermediaries could have transformed a large Aegean island into a continent-sized Atlantic empire. This is not proof. It is a hypothesis that fits some of the evidence and contradicts some of the other evidence. But it is the most archaeologically grounded explanation for why Plato's story contains the specific details it contains, and the excavation that began in 1967 on the island of Santorini produced evidence that made the hypothesis considerably harder to dismiss.
Part 3. What has been found?
In 1967, the Greek archaeologist Spirit ben Martinatos, the same man who had proposed the Thera-Atlantis connection in 1939, began excavating a site on the southern coast of Santorini called Akrotiri. What he found is one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries of the 20th century and one of the least discussed. In popular accounts of Atlantis, Akrotiri is a Bronze Age town buried under volcanic ash from the Thera eruption around 1600 BC, preserved in essentially the same condition as Pompeii, which was buried by Vesuvius 17 centuries later. The preservation is extraordinary. Multi-story buildings still standing, furniture still in place, storage vessels still containing their contents, sophisticated drainage systems, indoor plumbing running through the walls of private residences, and the frescoes of Akrotiri are among the finest examples of Bronze Age art in existence. They show a sophisticated urban culture, people in elaborate clothing, ships in harbor, exotic animals, landscapes that suggest contact with distant places. One fresco, known as the miniature fresco or the ship fresco, shows a fleet of large ships moving between 2 coastal cities, with crowds of people watching from the shore. The ships are detailed enough that naval historians have analyzed their rigging and construction. The cities are detailed enough that archaeologists have debated which specific Aegean locations they depict. One detail of Akrotiri is particularly relevant to the Atlantis discussion. The town was evacuated before the eruption. No human remains have been found in Akrotiri, unlike Pompeii, where the dead were preserved in the ash exactly where they fell. The people of Akrotiri knew the eruption was coming, or at least knew something catastrophic was approaching, and they left. They took their valuables with them. They left behind a town frozen in the moment of departure, food still in storage, furniture arranged as if the owners intended to return. Where they went is unknown. What this tells us about the people of Santorini in 1600 BC is that they were sophisticated, enough to recognize warning signs, and organized enough to coordinate a mass evacuation. These were not primitive people. They were the inhabitants of a maritime civilization at the height of its power, connected by trade to Egypt, to the Levant, to mainland Greece, who watched their world end from a distance and left no written record of what they saw. The linear A script of the Minoans has been found at Akrotiri. It has never been deciphered. Whatever the people of this civilization recorded about their own history, their traditions, their stories, their accounts of what they had seen and done, remains inaccessible. We cannot read it. This is the archaeological reality behind the Atlantis story. A real advanced maritime civilization centered in the Aegean disappeared in connection with one of the largest volcanic catastrophes in human history. A preserved town exists beneath the ash of that volcano, showing us in extraordinary detail what daily life in that civilization looked like. And the written records of that civilization remain undeciphered, locked in a script that no one has yet succeeded in reading. Whether Plato was drawing on a corrupted memory of this event when he wrote the Timaeus and Critias cannot be proven, but the existence of acrotery means that the Marinados hypothesis cannot be dismissed as fantasy. A real civilization was really destroyed. The memory of that destruction was really preserved in the cultures that survived it, and a philosopher writing 400 years after the Minoans disappeared really did produce a description of a lost maritime empire that contains details the advanced architecture, the sophisticated engineering, the sudden catastrophic end that paralleled the archaeological record of the Minoan world.
Part 4. The unfinished sentence.
There is a detail about Plato's Atlantis text that almost never appears in popular accounts of the story, and that changes the entire relationship between the reader and the narrative. The Critias stops in the middle of a sentence, not at the end of a section, not at a natural narrative break. In the middle of a scene, Zeus has just called the gods together for an assembly, he is about to speak, and the text ends. The Critias as we have it contains no conclusion, no destruction of Atlantis, no speech by Zeus, no resolution of the story that Plato spent an entire dialogue building toward. Every manuscript of the Critias that survives ends at exactly the same point, in the middle of Zeus's assembly, with Zeus about to say something that was never written down or never preserved. There are two explanations for this. The first is that Plato never finished the Criados, that he abandoned the project before completing it, possibly because he had moved on to other work, or possibly because he died. Plato died around 348 BC, roughly 12 years after the Timaeus and Criados were written, and there is scholarly debate about the order and completion status of his late dialogues. The second explanation is that the ending of the Critias was written but was lost, that at some point in the transmission of the text through centuries of copying and recopying, the final section disappeared. Neither explanation can be proven or disproven with the evidence available. What is certain is that the most detailed description of Atlantis that has ever existed, written by the only person who ever described the place, ends before the destruction happens. We have the civilization in extraordinary detail. We have the corruption that caused its downfall. We have Zeus calling the gods together to announce their punishment. And then there is silence. The story that has generated more geographical expeditions, more pseudo-archaeological theories, more books, more documentaries, and more sustained popular fascination than any other lost civilization narrative in Western history is unfinished. The author never told us how it ended, or if he did, the ending is gone. This is either a remarkable historical accident, or, if you read Plato, the way Plato scholars read Plato, a deliberate artistic choice. The Crias is not the only Platonic dialogue that stops without conclusion. Plato regularly left philosophical questions open rather than resolved, because his method was to provoke thought rather than provide answers. A dialogue that ends with Zeus about to speak with divine judgment suspended indefinitely leaves the reader in exactly the position Plato most valued, facing a question that cannot be closed. What would Zeus have said? What was the punishment for a civilization that had everything, chose corruption, and threatened to consume the world? The answer is somewhere in the gap between the last word of the Critias and whatever Plato intended to write next. It has been there for 2,400 years. Nobody has found it.
Part 5. What really lies behind Atlantis?
After 2,400 years of searching in the Atlantic Ocean, in the Mediterranean, in the Caribbean, off the coast of Spain, in Antarctica, in Bolivia, in the Azores, in the Sahara Desert, and most recently in the waters off Santorini, no physical evidence of Plato's Atlantis has been found. No ruins, no artifacts, no inscription, no geological formation that matches the specific description in the Critias, nothing. This does not mean Atlantis was impossible. It means that after 2,400 years of the most sustained archaeological search in human history, the thing being searched for has not been found. That is a significant data point. What has been found is something arguably more interesting. The archaeology of the Bronze Age Mediterranean has revealed a world considerably more complex, more connected, and more catastrophically disrupted than anyone understood before the 20th century. The Minoans built a maritime civilization that dominated the Aegean for centuries and disappeared within a generation. The Mycenaean Greeks who replaced them also collapsed. The Bronze Age collapse of around 1200 BC destroyed virtually every complex society in the Eastern Mediterranean simultaneously, and the causes of that collapse are still debated. The Sea Peoples, a confederation of migrants and raiders who appear in Egyptian records during this period, remain partially unidentified. The linear A script remains undisputed. The ancient world lost things. Civilizations, languages, technologies, and stories disappeared, and what survived into the classical period was a fragment of what existed before. Plato was writing for centuries after the Minoans disappeared, for centuries after the Bronze Age collapse, for centuries after a world that was, in some respects, more connected and more sophisticated than what replaced it had been destroyed by a combination of environmental catastrophe, invasion, and the specific fragility of complex systems under stress. If Plato was preserving a memory of any of that, if the Egyptian priests who supposedly told Solon the story were preserving their own records of the end of the Bronze Age world, then Atlantis is not a story about a fictional island. It is a story about what the ancient world knew it had lost and could not fully explain. A civilization larger than anything that currently exists, destroyed in a single catastrophe, gone without leaving a recoverable trace. The specific details wrong because details distort across centuries of transmission. But the core of it, the sudden end, the sea swallowing something that was there before, preserved because some things are too large to forget entirely. Or Plato invented it, made it up whole from his philosophical imagination, built it with enough specific detail to be convincing, placed it far enough away to be unverifiable, and gave it the ending he never wrote, because the ending was not the point. The point was the question. What happens to a civilization that has everything and chooses corruption? What does divine justice look like when it finally arrives? How should a society be organized to avoid the fate that the most powerful empire in history could not escape? These are not questions about a lost island. They are questions about every civilization that has ever existed, including the ones that are not lost yet. Atlantis has been searched for longer than any other lost place in human history. It has not been found. The story that describes it is unfinished. The civilization it most closely resembles archaeologically left a preserved town under volcanic ash and a written language nobody can read. The search continues. The text still ends with Zeus about to speak, and whatever he was going to say is still somewhere in the silence after the last word of the Creatius, waiting for someone to figure out what Plato meant to write next.
Epilogue. Atlantis, a place for curiosity.
Atlantis is the most searched-for place in the history of human curiosity. It appears in two texts by one author written in 360 BC. The author was a philosopher, not a historian. The story exists to make a point about power and corruption and the fate of civilizations that choose the wrong values. The description is specific enough that a real civilization, the Minoans of the Bronze Age, Aegean, matches it in ways that are difficult to dismiss entirely. The archaeological site that best corresponds to it is a preserved Bronze Age town, buried under volcanic ash on the island of Santorini, excavated since 1967, containing frescoes and buildings and evidence of a sophisticated maritime culture that before evacuated before a volcanic catastrophe and left no record of where they went. And the original text ends in the middle of a sentence, with Zeus about to speak, and no surviving manuscript contains what he said. This is what Atlantis actually is. Not a continent, not a lost civilization with advanced technology, not evidence of ancient aliens or prehistoric global civilization. A story, possibly the most important story ever invented for philosophical purposes, that contains within it the memory of something real, the imagination of something that should have existed, and the permanent question of what happens when a civilization reaches the limit of what its values can sustain. The island is still out there in the text, exactly where Plato left it. Zeus is still about to speak. And the Atlantic Ocean, which was named after Atlas, the Titan, whose name Atlantis carries, is still, as Plato described it, navigable, just not in the direction anyone has been looking. If you liked the video, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and follow for more.